double checking. Everyone's here for games and education, right? Awesome.
Good.
And we're out.
It could be Psych 101.
It borders into it.
Psych 101 would be in a large lecture hall.
Yeah.
Well, usually these rooms are full of chairs. What happened?
Yeah. So yesterday this room was full of tables. It was very weird.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say Eric can move in, but there's no in.
Yes, there is. We added a Helaina.
No,
It's
it's
fine.
levels. It's fine.
You can walk. Like,
I can walk around.
Ready?
Like Donahue.
Yeah.
Like Sally Jessica Raphael. I had Sally Jessica Raphael glasses and I was like.
Anyone who's standing, you are actually welcome to like fill in the front here. Like
Yeah,
there's
you
so
can-
much
yeah.
carpet space.
It's
like,
like
don't
elementary
hide.
school. You can sit
Again,
on the
treat it
rug
like we're in
at the
school.
front.
There's a carpet.
I
Use
live
it
really
really
good.
I live really good.
We accommodate all
I'm
learners
elementary.
in this
Not
classroom.
kindergarten, but yes. And then be like, do I
That's
get
right. No, if you're
I'm like, that's right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
If anybody needs a sit fit, you can go to my car.
plus, because we're obviously going to be yelling too, so the closer you get, the more you'll hear.
Yeah. So welcome to the panel on board gaming and education. We have an esteemed panel of educators, board game designers, board gamers who use who use board games educationally when they are teaching. So I'll start with myself. I'm the moderator. My name is Sen-Foong Lim. I'm a board game designer. I'm a psychology professor at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario, Canada. And I use games a lot in my educational pursuits. And we're going to go down the line, starting with...
Hi, I'm Kathleen Mercury. I'm a middle school gifted teacher in St. Louis, Missouri in the States, and I've been teaching game design to kids for about the past 12, 13 years. I share all of my game design resources for free at kathleenmercury.com. I do, yes, it's all free, like Semester Plus, because do it better than me, and it's the whole thing. I can talk about that later. I host a podcast, Games in Schools and Libraries, so you should check that out as well. If you do something really cool with games in your schools and you think you want people to know about it, talk to me about that as well. And then finally, which just happened this week, I'm now going to be on the Education Advisory Committee for GAMA, for Gaming Manufacturers Association. So I'm super excited about that to help get games into schools through GAMA. So I'm super excited.
My name is David Weiss, and I have been a Ontario certified teacher for about 20 years. Really, we should put OCT after our names every time we say them. I've taught everything from grade 3 to grade 12, or in the old days OAC, math, mainly in the secondary panel. For the last 10 years, I've been teaching grades 6, 7, and 8 at a small independent school. I also contribute to the Daily Worker Placement blog, which is why I have a press pass, and I'm currently the board game concierge at 401 Games in Toronto.
That's awesome.
My name is Cormier. I'm a board game designer. I also teach board game design at Vancouver Film School for part of their video game design program. And also I have incorporated and gamified a lot of projects for corporate use at Best Buy Canada, where my day job is, and I've also created some escape room in a box for corporate use with training purposes afterwards as well.
Excellent.
Hi, I'm Shannon McDowell. I am a research associate at Wilfred Laurier University in Brantford in the Game Design and Development program. So the motto of our program is games that change the world. So all of our students make games with learning outcomes and gamify different projects. They have done projects for museums, for corporations, for schools. And I was on the design team for the Red Bull Escape Room World Championships, which just happened this past April, which also had learning outcomes, although I'm sure the competitors didn't notice.
They didn't notice.
Yeah, it was a story around how much independence do we allow AIs.
I'm Helaina Cappel. I've been a teacher in the TDSB Toronto for 18 years. Last year I took a leave of absence, and I'm going to be going on my second year of leave of absence because I started a board game publishing company. I actually have two companies now. One is for family games, where the games are made for adults that kids can play. And one is for strategy games, and I've used games in the classroom for 15 years, and I have students create their own games based on the games we use in our class.
I am Hayes-Bouyouris. I'm a game designer. I also am an elementary school teacher in Toronto. So I end up using, funny enough, I can't use most of the games I design in my class because they're too old. But I do tend to have a lot of games in the classroom. Not only do I get kids to design them, typically as part of one of our math units, but it's also, there's a lot, and then this panel will be talking about it a lot, there's a lot of lessons to be learned, both socially and kind of thought process wise through games. They can literally change the way you think. So there's an amazing amount of depth that games can allow for children to learn through, or even like older kids learning through. I think we'll probably cover a lot of that on this panel.
And Eric and I also co-host a podcast, video cast that's on Wednesday nights live on Facebook called the Meeple Show, which is about game design and the industry in general. So not educationally focused, though we often
We've had episodes about games and education, targeting children with games, what goes into kids' games.
Because our other co-host is also an academic. So, anyways, we have a very broad range of academic people at the table. I'd like to just poll the crowd. How many people in the audience are educators? Wow! Yay! Yay! Teachers are awesome.
Some of us already back door.
Yeah. And how many people in the room are game designers? Or game designers, or like to be game designers. Yeah, great, excellent. So hopefully we'll get a lot out of this panel. I'm going to ask a couple questions of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions because we have a nice big audience today. So we'll probably go to questions sooner than we normally do. Okay. Kathleen, we had talked about setting up the 3 items that we wanted to talk about.
Yes.
What are they?
3 base things when we're talking about games and education, and people kind of fold them together. They don't necessarily always see the distinctions, especially outside of education, where you're talking about teaching kids to design games. That's one thing.
Okay.
That's what I do. Gamification of classrooms is another thing, and the third is game-based learning. So those 3 things often get lumped together when people talk about games and education, and making sure we're clear on what our particular spins are.
Right, so we'll take a couple minutes to discuss each of those items, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. I actually want to start with gamification, because it's actually, I think, one of the most or misinterpreted things out there in terms of education. I'll actually start with Jay, because you are actually probably, out of all of us, the one who uses gamification weirdly the most in teaching, because you teach at a corporate level.
Yeah, so a lot of people think gamification is like, oh, I added a Jeopardy game to this exercise, so I gamified it. And that's just adding a game to it, and that's fine, but it's not gamification. So I had the opportunity to run for Best Buy a big training event in which all these vendors come and want to train all the blue shirts on all sorts of stuff. And so
Blue shirts are
the blue shirts in the store.
The associates.
Salespeople. Advisors. And so I was given the full reins to gamify the entire process, and I turned the entire event into a big Zelda adventure. And so people had a name badge, and they had their level here that could slide out, and they could level up throughout the event. They earned experience points as cards for attending talks with vendors. For going to booths, they were given side quests to go into the dungeon, which was this big trade show of vendors, and they could go to up to these vendors with side quests and answer these trivia questions, and then go to this town hall, which was a different booth, and they would mark them, and they get experience points for answering questions. So they really had to go. And as they leveled up, there was some really nice passive peer pressure of people looking around saying, oh, that guy's already at level 6, and I'm only at level 2. And didn't have to say anything. And I remember when I pitched this to the executives, there was a lot of like raised eyebrows and like question marks and uncertainty, because for one full day of this event, there was 0 schedule, and that really scared a lot of people paying money for this event. A lot of vendors paid money for this, and there was no agenda. And I somehow convinced them that this was good. And there was the first time we actually had the validation of learning at a training event. Usually, maybe that's done afterwards, like let's check later to see if you learned it. By if they went on their map, there was some vendors that had similar icons or colors on them, and if they went to those vendors, they got a little stamp on each of them. They come up to the town hall and say, I went to these 3 vendors, and they're like, oh, cool. And they would then give them this key, and it would have a specific time and a specific room in this hotel that we were at, and they had to go to that hotel room at that time and meet other people that maybe accomplished that quest at the same time. And when they got there, those same 3 vendors were in that room again. there was a giant pixelated Zelda-type monster, and they had to battle this monster by answering questions of things they should have learned about at their booth. And so it was validating that they learned the information, and if they got the answer right, they got to throw this little magnet thing at this big giant monster, and if they hit it, they would peel heart pieces off of it until it died. And the higher their level was, the closer they got to stand to this big giant monster. And so at the end of the day, the VP of HR said, this is the most engaged I've ever seen any of our staff of all time. And my biggest takeaway was this one person came up to me. He had level 10, which was the highest level you can get. And he says, Jay, when you started talking about this in the first morning and you're kind of going through these rules and all these things you do, I was rolling my eyes. This is cheesy, this is silly. And as I started to get a few of these experience point cards, I kind of started to get into it. And he was the first one to get to level 10. And he's like, it was the best thing ever. Like, I loved it.
Psychology.
Yeah, it was super exciting. It was my most proud moment of working at Best Buy was running this entire huge event.
That's awesome. So now from that end of the table, what are your educational insights on what Jay did at that place, at Best Buy? What do you think?
Because ideally when you're teaching something, you need to deliver the information and then find a way of ensuring that it's been retained, right? And so traditionally that could be like, I taught something, I took a test. That's super boring. If you follow that reason, it's the same reason most of you remember nothing from high school and university right now, because you binged and dumped and you have no idea what that was about anymore. That is not a genuine learning experience. When you've earned something, when you go through the steps, when you have an actual tangible experience, that's how memory works. Anything that is novel, different, or stands out will stick out as a memory in your brain, and that will immediately be information you have not lost. Because they're connecting it to leveling up, because it's achievable, not only can I actually see my own progress, so I have immediate feedback as the learner, but I have to actually go through the final test. I'm not doing a written test. I am now having to use my recall, which is another way of reinforcing the information a second time, right? To actually be able to finish this end thing. And not only that, but how I finish the end level would also then tell my employers kind of roughly what score I got, because it's how much did I retain. What's really neat too then is that you have feedback as the person who then created the event in the first place, is that if everybody essentially failed the same question, well guess what? That question wasn't taught very well. That question wasn't delivered properly. And so you have feedback on both the learner and the educator side, where you can say, okay, well next time I gotta fix that problem. Don't assume you have to fix it right now. I know most of you in education, you know that. You'll come back to it later, but if you're new to education, don't worry about that stuff. You'll have more time. But that becomes your follow-up, is this one sector, well guess what? I guess we are not teaching this right. We need to revamp that part. But everything that came out correct means that thing has been retained, that thing was like properly taught, and odds are they will remember all of it.
Yeah, that's great. What other stuff have you done, Jay, in terms of escape room boxes? Because we're going to get to that in a second. So we're going to lead from you into what Shannon does.
So then not with Best Buy, I designed some escape room games in a box, kind of like Breakout EDU, if you're familiar with that concept. So I kind of did that, but for corporate purposes, and not just for fun, but for educational or training purposes, so that we would run this event, and then afterwards we would talk about something that the client wanted. So we have one coming up in which we're doing change management. So they wanted a session on change management. We're doing an escape room in a box. Halfway through the escape room box, we're going to take one person from each team and rotate them to a new team and say, you're now the leader of this new team. You're going to tell them what to do, basically. You're leading this team, and they're coming into a team that's halfway through a puzzle, which is very realistic to in a real world, as far as somebody moving over, getting promoted, changing jobs, and all of a sudden you're leading a new team. Figure out what the strengths of those people are and roll with it. So that's change management. We also talk about siloing. In the work world, a lot of departments are very siloed and they work on their own. And this is a very easy thing that an escape room box does, that everyone kind of works on their own. And when they finish, they just kind of sit back and relax. And afterwards, it's a great debrief. It's like, how come you never went around and helped other people? Like you were finished and you knew all the answers. Why didn't you help other people? Or you guys, how come you never even asked? You saw that they cheered that they were done. Time was ticking, and you saw the time. Like nobody asked for help, and so it was a great learning opportunity to show, like, and they really remember that.
Cool. Shannon, speaking of escape boxes and escape rooms and things like that, that's sort of your area of speciality.
That's my research area.
Right.
Yeah.
So what have we learned about how puzzles and those types of games, end up being able to teach learning outcomes?
Yeah, so that's that moves more into the game-based learning, where you have games that have learning outcomes. And so it's not like gamification is when you take something someone does in normal life that they would normally do and then add a bonus to it, make it a game. But it's not like Pokemon Go. It gamified walking. That's literally like probably the most common example of gamification. Pokemon Go gamified walking. It made you walk. It made it fun to walk. So game-based learning is where you create a game that someone comes away after the game having learned something. So escape rooms are really great for that because rather than a tabletop game or a video game where you're working kind of individually, maybe you're working together, but it's all very on the table or right in front of you. Escape rooms are very interactive. You're touching things, you're moving things, you're manipulating things. So it becomes more of an experience, and then you're engaging all types of learners in that experience. So all the tactile learners, visual learners, everyone is engaged. So the difficult part with escape room, learning is making sure that, like, you have to decide, is it the players who are getting the learning outcome, or is it, people observing the players? Like, it depends, because I make escape rooms for television, so in a lot of cases, it ends up being the viewers get the learning outcome, and the players are just kind of NPCs manipulating the pieces that the viewers watch. And
That's interesting.
It's really, there's a dichotomy there.
Yeah, for sure.
But, so when you have players going through an escape room, every puzzle needs to drive the narrative and you need to figure out what is the outcome of this. And I like it better in board games almost. Escape rooms are tough because puzzles,
It can be solitaire.
they can be solitaire, and they also, puzzles lend themselves to people just wanting to crunch numbers and just do the puzzle. And it's very easy to have a puzzle in a classroom escape box that is, oh, what date did this happen? And then the answer is a 4-digit lock that is the year, and that's fine. But yeah.
Does it cause retention?
No, not at
You'll
all.
dump that number the minute you use it.
Exactly.
Because you've
It's-
succeeded already.
Yeah.
The
So
feedback
that-
is I succeeded, my lock is open, dump the knowledge, go.
Yeah, whereas if you have players making decisions as they solve the puzzles, like that's a big thing Laurier does, is having decision points in the escape rooms. So at the end of, oh gosh, I shouldn't, this is probably spoilers. The TV show's not out yet. So for example, at the end of the Escape Room World Championship game, there was a decision that players had to make. So they've been engaging with this artificial intelligence throughout the game, and they knew this. They knew they were talking to this AI throughout the game. And they knew that the AI had an issue, but was still helping them. And at the end of the game, they had to decide, what are they going to do? Do they help this AI, or do they accomplish their goal? So it's this big decision point. And when you're in the adrenaline, sometimes you don't notice that there's a decision point there. So that's something like that. And then in a debrief afterwards, if you're doing this in a classroom or for learning outcomes, you can talk through, okay, well, why didn't you help? Or why did you help? Why did you make the decision you did? And people talk through, and the goal with the Red Bull one is to see what, like, if Siri wanted to not be on our phones anymore, what would we do? Does Siri have like agency? So that's that story.
And I want to mention real quick, because I mentioned Breakout EDU, and I saw some nods, but some might have been confused. So Breakout EDU, if you're a teacher, definitely Google that and check it out, because it's a kit, an open source kit that you can buy and or just make yourself. And there's lots of escape room challenges and adventures that have been created for it that you can use in the classroom.
We have 20 kits in my own one department that we use regularly. You both mentioned this wonderful word, and we're going to bring it over to Helaina as we talk about debrief. Debrief, game-based learning. I've known Helaina for years, and I know her teaching style is never this game is an educational game, therefore we're playing it because it's educational, right? She's like shaking her head, no, that's not what we do. Her real thing is, hey, we're playing this game, and it's a good game, and it's a game that you can buy out in the store. It's not like an educational game. It's a game, a real game. And then the debrief is, well, now what did we learn from that, right? So can you tell me a little bit about your practice in the classroom with games? What games do you think are good for teaching what? And how do you manage the debrief with elementary school students?
So the thing that I hate the most is a game that's called an educational game. Because they're not really, they're worksheets in the form of a board and a pawn and a die. Usually that's what they look like. So I'm always on the lookout for a game where you can have a learning outcome and you can debrief that learning outcome. I start the beginning of the year every year. I was talking about this the other day. I start every year with a cooperative game where all students have their own role in the game, and it's Forbidden Island that I use every year. All students that play the game have their own role. They come to the table, they learn together, but they know that throughout the game they have to do different things in order to win or escape and get off of the island. And for me, that is the most important game that I play with my students all year because it has them understanding how they're going to be working together, that each and every one of them has their own thing that they're good at, and they're bringing it to their group work. That I don't expect everyone to be doing the same role all of the time, and that's not the way we live in the world. So socially, this experience, we play the whole first week. They play every single day. Sometimes if they get to play more than one time a day. At the end of the week, we debrief. Why are we playing this game? And we talk about what group work looks like, and what they're bringing to the table. And there's a long process of what are the things you think you're good at that you're going to bring to your group so that we're going to do well this year, because I do a lot of group work. So I start every year with that. I spent several years as an intermediate math teacher and math and science teacher, and I found a lot of, every game has math in it, obviously, but some of them are better to talk about certain things in math than others. For example, the game that I've been using for years is Catan. Obviously, that's a probability game because you have 2 dice, and that's in the Ontario curriculum. But you can start looking at things such as parts of numbers, so fractions and decimals and percents in terms of the cards that are in the deck, the cards that are still available to take and have in front of you. If we know that there are 50 cards in the deck and 2 of them are Monopoly cards, then how much of the deck is left, or how much of the deck are those Monopoly cards 2 out of 50. So games like that, but I never go to an educational game. I try as hard as I can to find the math in games. The latest, biggest one, like I said, I haven't been in the classroom in a couple of years, but Sushi Go was a really big one. And probability and was huge with that. And there are other games that you can use for different areas of the math curriculum. But at the end of the day, it's not about actually playing. It's about actually thinking about what you were thinking about. So that metacognitive piece, where
my favorite word.
Yes, it is your favorite word. But thinking about what you were thinking about while you were playing, and that isn't just what is the math you learned, that's also how did you play? Why did you play that way? When you play next time, how are you going to play? What is your strategy for next time? What's going to help you be better at this game? And typically, if we're working on one game as a class, I'll have some sort of handout that has a chart on it where while they're playing, they can fill certain things out, whether it's math or the social aspect of it or the metacognitive piece of it. But definitely the most important part of playing those games is not actually playing them. recalling what was happening and why they made the decisions they made and how they're going to do it differently next time.
That debrief is so important.
And
So
procedurally, do you have like 5 copies of Sushi
Yeah,
Go and
yeah.
everyone plays it at the same time?
That's right.
Yeah.
So it's a bit expensive, but I happen to be in a school where we were trying to change things a little bit, and I approached the principal with this idea of, I started with Board Game Club, which actually helped in the classroom because I would teach 1 or 2 kids how to play a game, and then they could teach the rest of the class. That was very helpful.
Also super social.
Yeah, and very, very social. But it had, we started off with a few games, and after a couple of years, I said, you know, these games are working very well in my class. I need 5 copies so I can have each of my groups work on the game at the same time.
Cool. Excellent. David, how do you use games in the classroom?
I use them very similar to Helaina, including using Forbidden Island as a starting game. But I want to look at the big picture here, because
Sure.
if you're here, you are educators who are also tabletoppers. And naturally, you want to bring that passion into the classroom. And I think, to me, that's, like, it doesn't matter what you're passionate about. Maybe you're passionate about sports, or rhythmic gymnastics, or emo, or whatever it is, or Elmo. I think, especially at the elementary and middle school level, I just think it's really important for kids to see that adults have these extracurricular passions, that they are, and that they're passionate about things, and in their own way passionate about learning, but without making it explicit necessarily. So some of it is just bringing that energy into the classroom, that curiosity, the open-mindedness, the always looking for something. To me, that is the big picture. Starting with Forbidden Island for those, you know, hidden curriculum or soft skills is really important. I've used them. I do this thing called Good Math Afternoon. So when we finish a math unit, we celebrate by having like a couple of hours, or it could be Good Mathorning, depending on what my schedule looks like. So every week I'll teach the kids during some break or during lunch, I'll teach them a different game. There's always some kids who are more or less enthused anyway, some kids who are like been going to Snakes and Lattes since they were 9 and they play viticulture or whatever it is. So they can be naturally leaders there as well. But it's really interesting to see which kids kind of, you know, or which games from year to year. One year it was Monopoly Roller Coaster Tycoon. Of all the games, that was the one that the kids fixated on and went out on eBay and Amazon looking for copies and buying. And some years it's Boggle, and some years it's No Thanks. And so you kind of have to be, as a teacher, I think, well, I like to improvise in the classroom. I by nature. When I listen to Jay talk about this huge thing, all I could think about is, oh my God, the planning, how long did that planning take? And again, thinking as teachers, you want to bring these things into the classroom, you have to realize that the bigger the idea, the more front end it's gonna take, and the more you have to think about all this. But the good thing is that when you do it once, then it pays off in spades. But you really do have, like, another thing I was thinking of, well, that's fine for grown-ups, but ever try making groups in elementary school where you have to do groups of 4 and it's one of those LSAT logic games, so-and-so can't be with so-and-so, because you know what happens there, or, you know, and so it gets tricky. It is tricky. You have to think about these little logistical things too. So I've used it also for the biodiversity unit for science in grade 6. The culminating task was to design your own board game. And it would be amazing to see which games the kids would be copying from, whichever games they happened to be fixed on that year. But sometimes the original designs were quite amazing. Some of them I'd say were like practically store ready. But you really have to build. I love rubrics, so I make sure to be ahead of time, very explicit about what the expectations are, and to have, you know, those checkpoints, because designing a board game is not easy. So you want to scaffold it and break it down into those little steps. I have them do a proof of concept first to sort of explain what the game is about. You know, is it going to be competitive or cooperative? How many players? Is it going to be interactive or mainly solitaire? Is it going to be take that or not? You know, for them, what's a typical turn going to look like in words and so on. They have to finish that first before they go on to the next checkpoint, and you build these checkpoints in because you're looking, and I don't let them work on it at home. They have to work on it in class because then I can observe them working together as the group as well, because all sorts of interesting things happen in grade 6, as some of you may know. So that's all I'll say right now.
Excellent. Like, did you plan to segue right into what I was going to ask?
Yes, I did, Sam.
Awesome. Because we're going to talk to Kathleen now about game design and teaching how to design games with students, whether gifted or not, whatever grade. How do we do that?
Well, so there's a few things I want you guys to know going into this. One, all teachers are game designers. When you design any type of lesson, and then you test it with your students, right? And then you figure out what doesn't work, and you make notes and you refine it and go on from there. And we're comfortable doing that in the classroom, whatever it is. But when it comes to games, because it's a new medium for you and for kids, so like if a lesson doesn't work, you've got this whole repository of skills where you're like, okay, I know what I'm gonna do next time. When you make a game and it doesn't work, you and or the kids don't necessarily have that repository of experience. What I do with teaching game design, I teach kids, we learn about mechanics, we learn about objectives, we all this. We fail fast. Look up the Stanford D-School method of prototype development, because that's what I use as the underpinning. They have a ton of free resources available for educators, it's great. But the one thing is for my students, and this, even though I teach gifted kids, but my students have never experienced struggle or failure in schools. They might have classes that are not good for them. They may have their own like organizational executive functioning issues that get in the way. But ultimately, generally speaking, you know, my students are successful. And so when I give them game design, and when you teach game design or you design a game, at the end, it will not be finished, it will not be perfect, it may not work, it may not be good, now feel successful.
That needs to be a shirt.
Right.
I would
You know what I
totally
mean?
wear that
Game
shirt.
design is, I want to embark upon a process of kids set the problem, which is what they want their game to be, and they have to figure out how to get there, and they probably won't get there by the end. And so what I'm doing when I'm teaching kids game design is I'm trying to, everyone's like, oh, but this is so good. They need to learn this. This is a life skill. It's hard on me, and it's hard on them every single time. I am ripping off the Band-Aid. I am the cold cup of coffee. Yes, you are still gifted. It is okay that your game didn't work. You are still very, very small. And I've got kids who will complain about it the whole time, and then by the end of the semester, they're working on their next game that will exist outside of me. I've got kids who get every single bit of positive reinforcement about their game, but because to them, it's not good, they consider it a failure. And every single time that happens, I think, I should not do this anymore. And I'm not kidding.
No, it's happened to me too, absolutely.
You know, I mean, and that's the thing, it's like, are they getting the message if they're not feeling successful? So what you really have to do, if you're wanting to do game design, like, because I do pure game design, it's a semester-long class. We start out playing games, we do like 4 cycles of iteration of their games. It's really an amazing experience. But it's really about coaching kids through seeing success as a process. Seeing success as you can have something unfinished and still find it worthwhile to do.
You can be part of that process, actually. If you're on BGG, boardgamegeek.com, Kathleen posts her students' results every year.
Yeah.
And we go through them and we are wowed at what happens with that.
It's very important, if they haven't, to do a thing about giving and receiving feedback.
Oh.
That is a huge, huge thing.
I could talk about this, and if you'd like to know more, Games in Schools and Libraries, KathleenMercury.com. Because one of the main reasons for like the Stanford method of prototype development is it starts with empathy, understanding the needs of your user. And when you think about a 12 and 13-year-old, how high are they up on that empathy chart? They're working on it. You know, they can be crazy empathic, and then they can be just monsters, and it's great. It's so fun. But the thing is it's all about understanding the needs of your user. And so if there's something fun in your game, do that. How do you give good feedback? I've got very specific structures that I use that are amazing. Kids go from being afraid to show their games to wanting to get their games on the table. When are we going to play test next? The wink method. And when somebody doesn't bring in their feedback, like, where's my feedback? You were supposed to bring in my feedback form. And so to have that shift for my gifted kids, they have a hard time seeing success because they focus on that object, but when I see that type of growth in terms of showing vulnerability, being okay to fail in front of other people, that's huge for them. And when I say what at the end, a lot of what my assessment is not about how good their games are. The rules I can get a little bit crunchier when it comes to grading because it's technical writing and standards-based and all that stuff. But when it comes like, what did you get out of this? It's, what did you learn from this that you will take to other things? Because if they only think it's about game design, I've taught them nothing, right? And they're like, if I've got trouble with an idea, I can have other people help me with this idea. And all of those different things are where really what success is. So much of what I've done over the years is shifting the approach from the game as the goal to who you are as a person as the goal in terms of that transformative effect. I want them to take on challenges. I want them to say, hey, there's that weird thing. I want to do this weird thing and I don't care what other people say. I could talk about this forever.
You're essentially teaching perseverance. It's not something that a lot of people have naturally. It is something you have to push people in order, they both have to be able to recognize it and experience it before they are good at it. Right. And so at its core, either playing through a game or designing a game will give you that on both sides.
Right. Right.
So it's game design as a
and
not
giving
as a skill.
examples from real life of like, the story of Alan Moon, who like had been, he's the guy behind Ticket to Ride. I mean, he'd been designing games for 20 years or something before he hit on Ticket to Ride. He'd had his own company. All his, you can talk about that because many of them have played Ticket to Ride, or you talk about Bananagrams, which had been originally called Take Two, and like showing them real examples, or even using examples from video games, like the story of Notch from Minecraft. Although it's not as big a thing as it used to be, it can still be.
Oh, the creeper's so scary.
So I think like learning from their heroes, or from Ticket to Ride actually didn't work at first. All these different things, I think is.
I've got two last things, especially for them because they tend to be very successful in other avenues of life. We talk about how much work did it take for you to playing the violin to get where you are right now. You have to give them a comparable framework for them to understand that success and growth in order to help them do that. The second thing is I started designing games because I was having them do it. And there's nothing more like empathy where like, here's this mess, I don't know what I want to do with it, and they see me going through the process. So as I've had some successes in game design with my own games towards getting published, I share that with them because they see when my game's a mess, and I model for them by doing it. So if you're teaching game design, start making games too. Because you'll have better empathy for them and what you're putting them through, which is huge. But also too is, then you get to make games too, and at some point, you're like on the other side of a table, you're like, how did this happen? It all started out because I was just looking for better games for them for the classroom. How did this happen?
Students love testing games, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Like, love it. Especially if they can learn it and then teach it to their friends, because they feel special. Like, I know the rules already. I know something that nobody else knows yet. They love being part of that process.
Excellent. Does anybody else have anything to add before we open the floor for questions? No? Good. Okay, questions. Yes. Back.
A long time. So I'm surprised because I always assumed that the curriculum was pretty structured, and it's like the government itself is pretty specific to what you have to teach.
There's so many ways of getting
there's
around.
There's going to be a difference between American and Canadian.
That's true. I also teach at a gifted class,
so you're more open.
Like it's super open with what I can do, and that's awesome.
I also teach at a college level, so it's my rules.
Yeah.
But for example, I had the last several years of teaching, I had a really big emphasis on STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. Using the design process with STEAM, it's exactly the same thing you would do with getting your students to design games. So you can massage the curriculum standards to find a place for them in your game design, even just playing games.
Because the curriculum is really about an outcome. So if the outcome is just saying, I need to know this, it's up to you how they learn that thing, and that's where you have complete flexibility, right? And so again, we're talking about at the end of the game, what was it the thing that you've learned? Well, then I'm going to now have to build backwards, like it's backward structuring, right? How do I build something, a game, that's going to deliver that information in a memorable way, right? And that's where, again, the game is really important because anything, again, that's memorable, you honestly retain. So that's a big part of it. Just know that the curriculum is not super rigid because it never tells you how to teach it.
That's right.
That is completely up to you.
That's not always true with independent schools, I will say.
Well, they have their own philosophy
I was
and approach.
recently at an independent school where they were saying, we don't teach carrying and borrowing. And I'm like, we don't teach carrying
Do they
and
do
borrowing?
grading parts? Is that what
I don't know, there was just, I mean, some departments or in some places and some principals in some schools are very doctrinaire. So there you have no leeway, just for those of you, just to say. And I don't know how it,
At other levels?
yeah.
At the college level, we have outcomes as well. So we have essential learning outcomes, skills outcomes, and vocational outcomes. And we can teach them whatever we want. Yes?
So I'm usually secondary history, social studies, and one thing I like to try to do, especially in the history streams, is use role play.
Yes.
So like the Munich Agreement, you put that in front of a grade 10 history student and you tell them about it, and 5 minutes later they're going to forget who the players were, what they wanted. So I'll build an actual simulation. I'll be like, you're this country, you need to pick a leader, this is what your outcomes are, and stuff like that. But the problem is that I run into, because say the Munich, you have like 5 big players.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to get groups of 4, and I try to get them, like, work as a group, send out diplomats to talk to other countries, but invariably you're going to get the kids that sit at the back of the room, pull out their phones, and just tune out completely.
So, oh, okay, sorry.
I was going to say, how do you remedy? Like, how would you suggest remedying that?
I would just suggest looking at, have you ever heard of Watch the Skies?
No.
Okay, so Watch the Skies is a mega game. So it's meant to be played with like 50 or more people, but you can scale it down. They have classroom versions. And what it is it's basically an alien invasion scenario that you play all day. A lot of conventions do it. So every team is a country, and they have like a leader and a diplomat and an engineer and like their science leader, their military leader, that kind of thing. And each individual player plays a different game with, like, the military leader goes and plays games with all the military leaders from all the countries, and then they come back together and debrief and decide on what their next moves are. It's something you might want to look at for those to adapt to that kind of scenario, because then everyone's involved in their own individual game, and then the
That's
team
still
works
Yeah,
together.
so it's like a jigsaw kind of thing.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
going to say that just giving individualized roles, so that even if it's not to that extent, because that takes a lot of prep in terms
Yes,
of designing the
well,
games.
they have classroom versions of
Right.
similar types of things.
But like one person becomes like the art. Well, I mean, you can either assign them, specific people. You're von Ribbentrop, you're Molotov, you're this, and then they're responsible for that role. Or they one person is the archivist, or you make some of them press or media, so that some people aren't necessarily in the simulation. They are reporting. Like I do a town council for biodiversity, where a town's trying to decide how big a dam to build, and so I've realized over the years, I was using one of the curriculum things I got out of the old Ontario curriculum documents, but I beefed up the media thing, because in this way, not every kid, there's also a habituation point where you don't want to gamify everything. So anyway, my point is that for some kids, they're more comfortable in an observer role.
Yeah,
and
I do that in a
note-taking
civics
role.
type class where like they run a mock election.
Yes.
And there's a media group has to put out a newspaper report every day about what happened the previous day. Right? So I've definitely incorporated
Yeah,
that.
so I just recently had someone on I recorded an episode for Games in Schools and Libraries. It's not out yet, but he's a Canadian social studies teacher, I think at the middle school level, who uses some pretty complex war games to teach different aspects of Canadian history. I forget his name, it's gonna be coming out soon.
Where's
but,
it from?
Canada? Somewhere, I think, middle?
Sorry, you said you were from Florida, right?
Okay, it's all the same, really. You're welcome in my home anytime. Anyway, sorry.
Just like St. Louis.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Wait, sorry. There, I said it right. Anyway, okay. Sorry. Okay, I love it here. P.S. When I crossed the street on accident not paying attention to lights. Not only did no one hit me, they didn't even honk at me. I was like, it was nice. Anyway, point being, he, especially when he does one game with the whole class, I had a lot of questions about student engagement. And one of his things is he incorporated some specific structures in terms of, yes, you had a partner, but they both had their own individual responsibilities for assessment. And that's the thing too. Because yeah, if you've got, you know, your alpha gamers who are gonna like try to run the game, you gotta watch that. You know, like, you have to be ready and have that set up to press that.
Yeah, it really comes down to personal responsibility, right? Is what, and I guess also too is like personal outcome. Is somehow you're going to have to be assessing each one individually. So then dividing up the rules is a great way to do it, but then you also have to say, okay, what is the output I'm looking for from those roles? And I guess as long as you're very clear on this role, I'm going to be kind of evaluating on this output, going back to the rubric idea, then they know that it's like, but that's what I'm responsible for, and that's how I'm actually going to prove that I've learned through this experience. Because if I sit back, there's no way I can even score. It's sitting back has now said, I'm basically not even going to like try to get a grade. In that part, you're talking about a totally different issue, right? It's not the games engagement issue. Now you're talking about something separate.
Typically use it as a formative as opposed to a summative.
Yeah, that's smart.
Because I want them to, like I kid you not, on exams I've had them refer back to that experience to say like, this is
reflection
like, yeah,
would be
exactly.
a great way to look at that.
Okay, okay.
So speaking of rubrics, does anybody have rubrics that they can share at some point? Okay,
I'll
good.
figure out how to do that, but
Yeah, so we'll figure out how to get that information out to you guys. Erica and I are on Meeple Syrup, and so if you go onto Facebook and look up Meeple Syrup, join that. We'll have some way to get David's rubrics to you. I have rubrics for other things that might be interesting. Kathleen probably has some too. Other questions? Yes?
Hi, so I actually work at a pharmacy school down in Buffalo.
Oh, cool.
So some of the things that we've been trying is trying to gamify some of our classrooms. So one of my coworkers actually did an escape room for biostats, and I did something a little bit different in terms of diabetes education. But some of the things that we're running into is it's really just a lot of like information, and kind of, especially because it's advanced information. So a lot of the things aren't like a simple yes or no. A lot of them are decision making. So we're just kind of trying to figure out mediums to, I guess, make that easier to put into the classroom, especially since we don't have the full day with students. A lot of times we have an hour and a half type of things. So anything in terms of higher ed, like.
We do, well, I don't do it, but I help make the pharmacology escape room stuff, so we should talk after.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Oh, no, I was gonna say, do you guys ever like either send kids to BGG to learn, like watch the videos or record stuff yourself?
I've played playthrough videos and watch videos with the kids sometimes, especially when I go to start doing units on game design and game building. They're not necessarily aware of what's out there, so I actually intentionally use even like top 10 lists and things like that as like a kind of fast exposure to a bunch of things at once.
No one wants to read anymore, right? So this is the thing. So for something that's like homegrown like yours, you could pre-record like bits and pieces, like chop it up into bits and then have them, you know, assign them to watch it in bits. Because there's no time in class to do it either. Like so, and at that age they should be accountable enough that they do it. That's what I would.
So on that point, I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to hear about the expectations you set for writing instructions or rules for the games that they design. The panel yesterday mentioned how challenging it can be to actually write down the rules.
Yeah.
So for younger students, for students with writing disabilities, what models do you use?
So I would say listen to the Games in Schools and Libraries episode with Jay Cormier, who talks about some really great examples. We talked about this in the rubrics one too, as far as, well, you can talk about yourself.
I just have a great way of teaching how to write rule books, and it's just using snakes and ladders or chutes and ladders, and have them identify the key components that are in a rule book, put them on different index cards, then have them in each index card write what would go on there, 4 chutes and ladders, put them in the right order that you would expect them to be in a rule book, and then before taking it up, we watch a video that's online that you have to Google about a dad teaching having his son and daughter explain with written instructions how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it's hilarious because he not misinterprets, he follows it to the letter how to make it, which is always wrong. And then I ask them, do you want to take a minute to review your rules? And everyone's like, yes, yes, I want to make it more clear and specific. And it's the best way to teach how it works.
Scott Nicholson at Laurier, in his first year analog game design class for the rules writing lesson, he starts off the first half of the class with, well, he uses shaving cream, but it's icing, and asks students to write rules on how to ice a cake. And so they get about 5 minutes to do that. They write out their rules, and he goes through the rules one by one and literally tries to ice the cake with the shaving cream based on their rules. And usually we will have the back of the room filled with students from all the other years who are like, is this the shaving cream lesson? Because peanut butter gets way too messy.
Watching the video.
But he literally does it, and it is the most engaging.
You're essentially talking about procedure writing, which is already part of the curriculum. Right. It is an essential. So what you're really doing is you're pulling in more ways of looking at procedure writing. But a really good point here was the idea of models and examples. Even as game designers, what we tend to do is find a game we really like the rules of and often follow that format, follow the way that they went about approaching it, because we liked it for a reason. It taught us easily. Most of the time, most of you guys know this too, but remember, visual and kinesthetics are the way that majority of people learn. Most people in this room, if you have any type of learning disability at all, us sitting up here talking, we lost you a long time ago, right? And that's just the reality of a classroom. So what's good is that you're talking about foundational language, like foundational writing is procedure writing, but then go past that. So this is a great idea of starting off with the idea of like just a simple, what's the procedure to something that you always do? Then how do you extrapolate that, also having the model or the examples, put those two things together, now you should have a really good output for rules. But it is the scaffolding. You have to build to that end output, otherwise you're never gonna get what you wanted from it, and you're just gonna frustrate the kids.
And for children who have specific learning disabilities, like whatever they may be, you can use differentiated learning methods, or actually for them it'd be differentiated presentation methods, to maybe instead of using words, use pictures, do a video and talk instead of writing down, and then move them into, now how do you translate that into something that can be deliverable in a box if it's going to be a game design, in a game design course?
Another thing is that often when we're teaching kids how to play a game, we teach them. We don't have them read the rules. And it's really important for them to read the rules of other games, especially if they already know how to play the game, because then it will become familiar to them. Yeah. So using those as exemplars of what we want to base our rules on, the goal of the game, then the steps to setting up the game, and so on, really important to actually study them.
Yeah. There's a lot of background information that once you understand the lingo and verbiage of game design and of game rules, that will help with reading fluency, comprehension, all those things with children who might have difficulty otherwise. If they're really engaged in learning rules and really engaged in gaming, that's a direct path for their brain.
Yeah, and one thing I would say too is, like, for you in the classroom, if you want to have any type of game-based activity, look at existing published games and how you can apply what you want to do to those games. Because like, to make up a whole new game and add on that layer of content, you've got two big wheels that may not be in sync with each other for a long time. But taking something existing that you think you can use, like how can you use Sushi Go, and turn that into a game.
I'm just going to jump to you because we had what did you have?
So it was really nice for Shannon to bring up Scott Nicholson. So I'm actually a games researcher at the University of London.
Okay, cool.
So so thank you for all your examples. And I think one thing in common is that everything is supervised and in person and very tactics. But have you guys had any success with digital games or unsupervised games?
So I have some examples of digital games and stuff that our students have done as work projects. Actually, one with the University of Waterloo just last semester. One of the linguistics programs wanted to gamify. They were collecting literary devices, like metaphor and alliteration and that kind of thing. I don't know why. It was a research project. So they wanted all these literary devices from the public, and who wants to sit on a website and enter literary devices? So they hired our students to make a video game that people could play at home or students could play in classrooms, being taught this in high schools. and enter literary devices. So it ended up being a video game where it's like this alien library that is looking for wanting you to join their federation. It was, yeah.
And then just crowdsource the
yeah, and so it was gamifying it. So as people entered literary devices, they were all like, all the remote players were working together to solve a puzzle every week, and then they were earning points and badges, and it was an entire system that they designed. So I haven't gotten any information on the outcomes of them implementing that game because it still needs to be built. But that is one example that yes, that is done. And there's digital games out there. Steve Wilcox has created a game about diabetes, and so it's more of a role-playing video game for children and parents of children with diabetes to basically take them through the choices that are made with these children and how hard it is to have a social life and what decisions they have to make, basically to build empathy. So yes, it's totally possible to have digital games with learning outcomes. But unless I don't have any specific data on the outcomes of those, but yes.
You have to learn a lot of programming. I mean, there's some foundational ones where you can learn pretty quick. So the idea of like the if-then statement trees and looping back into things. I mean, you can look at things like Twine and stuff like that, where you don't really need to know programming, and once you launch it, it can actually look almost maybe more like a text-based game. You can add visuals and things like that too. You need maybe very minor HTML, like awareness. There's more and more programs that are being designed to help you build your own apps, but again, you're gonna have that learning curve of how much digital information do I know, how much programming information do I know, what kind of programming information do I know. So you have to just be careful, I guess, about that, because it's assumed a lot of prior knowledge before you build something. But there are some more base ones, as I said, like kind of like a Twine sort of idea, where you can build a really simple, what would seem like video game-like, right? Without being that kind of that one step back, so you don't have to teach yourself all of that.
Can I recommend something? So Classcraft is a website basically that's kind of like a virtual world that you can then kind of provide students with different questions and stuff for them to do. So it's very visual, it's very pretty, there's a lot of music, and it's very easy to use.
Excellent. Well, we do actually have to end this wonderful, wonderful panel. So thank you very much to our guests. Thank you to everybody out there. If you have burning questions, I'm sure some of us will be out in the hall once we get out of here. Do look us up online. Most of us are readily available on Facebook. And we'd love to answer your questions of all people who are fellow educators or people in the education system, people who want to design games for educating. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wait, Erica, sit down, we get a picture. Oh, sorry.